In this section, we're going to be taking a look at a scenario where you may need to grant a user permission in SQL Server with an expiry date. Now, that is not available out of the box. So what we're going to be doing in this lesson is creating a custom solution. So a scenario could be MR joined the organization and MR need temporary access for say 30 days to access a database. But SQL Server does not come with that capability out of the box, where you could grant a user permission and after 30 days it expire and remove those permissions that the user have. So we're going to be developing our own custom procedure that will allow you to grant the user access and remove it after the expiry date has been reached. So with that said, let's head over to my laptop and get right into it. So what I'll be doing first is that I'll be creating a demo database called permissions. So to do this, right click on databases, specify the name of the database and then select OK. So we could have also used this command to switch the database use. So the first thing we need to do here is that we need to create a table that will capture the permission of the user that we need to grant permission. So we need to have their login name. We need to capture the permission that we are granting. We need an expiry date when the user permission should expire and a date when the access was granted. Now this will be default and we want to ensure that all of these are set to not null. Now for the permission name, we are setting it to unique because a user can have more than one permissions on a database. So if we grant a read access, right? We don't want when we run the procedure to grant read access again, the entry will be added to the database. So if you try to grant data reader to say MR twice, then it will fail. Now the next thing that we need to do is that we need to develop a store procedure that will allow us to grant the user permission. So if the login doesn't exist on the server, it creates it and grant the permission. If the login already exists on the database, we're going to be altering that login and map it to the user. So here we're assuming that the user already exists, right? And then once we do that, we're going to grant the relevant permission we need to the user. So here for the store procedure, let's change this to create. We are setting the login name, the database that we want to grant the permission on, the permission that we want to grant, a comment which is optional, and the expiry date. Now let's scroll down and take a closer look. So let's scroll down. So here we are switching the database. So here we are basically switching the database to the one that we passed to the store procedure. Now this is all dynamic SQL, and if you want to learn more about TSQL or develop your TSQL skill, you can check out our Ultimate TSQL course. The link will be in the description of this video. Now here, after we set the database that we want to use, we are checking if the login exists on the server. So if the login doesn't exist, we're going to be creating the login on the server. So let's get rid of this line of code because we don't need it. Now the next step is to check if the user already exists on the database. So if the user does not exist on the database, we'll be creating that user. So remember, you create a login and then you map a login to a user. Now here we can then grant the permission to the user by adding them to the role that they need to be a member of to access the database. So this could be your data reader role or your data writer role or your data writer role. Now the next thing we're going to be looking at is if the user exists. So if the user already exists in the database, meaning you could have granted them say data reader permission and now you need to grant them data writer, in that case you will not need to create the user account again. You just need to grant them the permission that they need. So here we're just ensuring that we map the user to the respective login that needs to access the database. And then here we are granting the permission that they need, keeping track of the user permission in the table so we can then later revoke the permission once it hit the expiry date. Now the next store procedure we need to create is the one that removes the expired permissions, right? It doesn't accept any parameter but it will use a cursor to traverse the permissions table to check if a user has expired. So a cursor basically allows you to process record in a table individually. So you go row 1, row 2, row 3, so on and so forth. Again, this is in our T-SQL course. The link will be in the description of this video, or the full name to this course. It is also available here on Udemy. So basically here we are declaring a cursor called expired cursor for this select statement here. So what we want is the login and the permission that we'll need to remove if the permission has expired. So here we're just opening the cursor, and then we are fetching the data into the variables we declare above. So it goes line 1 in the table, get the login name and the permission that the user have. So this is just basically the while loop that will loop through all the data in the table. This is just a display statement saying, hey, revoking permission for a user, right? So the first thing we're doing here is that we're deleting the record from the permissions table. Now, but what if we want this for audit purpose later? We'll see how we handle that later on. And then we are removing the user from the role that they were in. So if they had the data reader role, we are dropping that login from the data reader role. And this is just basically fetching the next record in the table to be processed. Then we close the cursor and deallocate the cursor. Now here's a basic script that will grant a user permission for 30 days. So all I need to do is just execute this and the permission is granted. So what we're doing here is that we're declaring an expiry date, and we're setting the expiry date 30 days in the future, right? So if we want it to be, say, 40 days, then we change the date parameter to 40 days. What this is doing is that it's adding 40 days to the current date. So what I'm doing here is basically calling the grant database login access, passing the login name which I want to grant access, let's say MRM. The name of the database is test224. The database is here, test224. The permission we're granting is DB writer, and the expiry date will be 40 days in the future. Now, if we expand testDB and expand security and expand users, we'll see that we don't have a MRM, right? Let's minimize this. Now let's check security as well. Now let's check security at the instance level. Now if we expand login, there's no MRM. So let's execute this statement. So I got an error, could not find store procedure, grant database login access. So let's scroll up and execute these two procedures so they are in the database, as well as creating the table. So the table has been created. Now create the store procedures. Now we need to create the revoke expired permissions. Let's execute this. Alright, so that one was executed already. Now let's reattempt granting the user permission. Let's execute. So here we have login created with password 123. Now let's refresh logins. Now here we can see that we have MRM. Now let's check which permission the user have. So let's double click. If we go to user mappings, you should see that the user have data writer access on the database. Now let's try re-executing the procedure again to basically grant the same access. Now let's scroll down. You'll see that it fails. Violation of unique constraint because the user already have data writer permission. Now let's grant data reader permission. Let's highlight and execute. Let's validate that. Double click the user, check user mappings, and its permissions database. So now you can see that the user have data reader and data writer. So let's click OK. Now let's check our permissions table. Expand tables and let's query user permissions. So select up 1000. And here we can see the two permissions the user have. So to check the current date, to use get date. Let's execute. So the current date and time is October the 21st. And if you check the expiry date that was granted to the user, you'll see that it's November the 30th. Now let's simulate revoking a permission. So we're going to be editing a record and ensure we have an expiry date. Edit up 200 rows, and we're just going to be modifying the data reader permission. Right, so we have modified the date to September the 30th. Now let's close. Now let's execute the query to ensure it was committed. So this permission would have expired. Now let's go and execute the revoke permission. Execute. Now we can validate this by right-clicking user, selecting properties, selecting user mapping. Now let's select the permissions database, and we can see that the user no longer have the data reader permissions. So you could have this procedure running on an automated job to run nightly to remove user permissions that were expired. So now let's take it to another level. We want to keep track of the user permission that was revoked and when it was revoked. Because if we query the user permissions table now, let's do a right click, select up 1000 rows. We now see that we only have one record and it's the permissions that is active. So to keep track of this, we need to create a trigger that logs the record in an audit table. So now we need to create an audit table. This would have an audit ID, which is auto-incremented, the login name, the permission, the expiration date, a comment, the date it was granted on, and the date it was revoked. But here I just have deleted on, right? And this is the trigger that will fire after the user has been deleted. Now you may be asking, what is a trigger? A trigger is a special type of procedure that fires when an event occurs. So you could have it after a delete, you could have it before a delete, you could have it after an update, you can even have it on a select, right? So in this case, we're doing it after a delete. So now let's create the trigger. Now we're going to modify the existing record in the table so it have an expiry date. So we're going to be editing top 200 rows, and we're going to be setting it to September the 30th. Now let's ensure this is saved. Okay. Now let's execute the procedure to revoke the permission. Now let's create a user permissions table. The record is no longer there. So let's refresh the database. Now here we can see the user permissions audit. So let's do a select up 1000. And here we can see that the DB writer permission was expired on September the 30th. It was granted on October. This won't make logical sense, right? Because we're testing. And it was deleted on October the 21st. So guys, I've made a mistake and I could have easily redo the video, but I'm going to show you the mistake that I made and how I'm going to correct it, right? It's okay to make mistakes. You can only learn from them, right? So let's scroll up back to where we had the create table statement. So here are the permission name as unique. So if I wanted to grant a data writer to more than one user, I would have an issue, right? So the first thing we need to change here is remove the unique, right? So let's drop the table, and to create the primary key now in order to create the primary key for this table, we're going to need a combination of the database name, the login name, and the permission, because an instance can have multiple databases. So if you had observed, when we check the permissions table, you would have seen where the permissions were granted, but we don't know which database it was granted on. So to address that, we need to add the database name to this table as well. Now we need to add the primary key, and it's going to be a composite primary key. So it's primary key, and for it to be a composite, it's going to accept the login name, the permission name, and the name of the database. So MR can only have read-only permission on database X. So let's recreate the table. Now based on how the solution is designed, right, the permissions would be granted on the database it executes from. So if you scroll down, you would have noticed here, I would have had the test 24 database here as the database that I wanted the permissions to be granted on. But when we check the permissions, they were on the permissions database. Now to address that, let's scroll up. We would need to execute all of these statements here dynamically on the target database. So in the interest of time, I've made a modification to another script, right? So let's scroll down and take a look at it. So now we have a third variable called db. This will set the database that we want to execute the script on. So in this case, we're adding it to the instance, so we're fine there. Here we're setting the database name that we want to use that was passed in the store procedure. Now here we're executing the script dynamically on the target database. So we're using the database that we want to execute on, and then we're executing this query there to check the principal if it exists, or the database user if it exists on the database. If it doesn't exist, we create it, right? So now let's recreate the store procedure. So I actually altered it instead of create, right? Now let's scroll down and do another test. So we're going to be creating a different user here called demo user 5, right? And we're going to be granting the permission on the database called demo 2024. And the permission we're granting is data writer. So let's execute. Now let's refresh security. Here we have the demo 5 user. Now let's check the properties, user mappings, and you can see that the access is granted on the demo 24. And for the audit table, I've made the adjustment to the audit table as well. And same thing for the trigger, I've made the adjustment to the trigger. So I've made the adjustment to the revoke procedure as well. So in the resource section of this lecture, you will find all the documentations available. Now this is a very important piece of procedure. It doesn't matter which organization you go in. Chances are once you use SQL Server, this may be a problem you will run into, and this solution will save you a lot of time, because let's say you have 10 users that need a temporary permission. Now you need to keep track of each user and when they expire. So how are you going to do that without an automated process? This could easily result in you forgetting that a user permission need to be removed. So a solution like this will save the day and save you a lot of time. So that's it for now, guys. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.